Philosophers talk to our times. We, the modern citizens of dystopia. One of the kind of interesting moments in philosophical anthropology of living in dystopia is watching what's the end of the social contract. Those elements of the state. And those elements that very interestingly collapse. And behind this is a thought about the failure of Starmerism. There wasn't a Starmerism to fail, but you know what I mean, the failure of the current British Prime Minister, which is slightly more interesting than you might think, and certainly more interesting than him the man. But let me take you right back to what I mean by the failure, the collapse of the social contract. Now, being the good son of a psychoanalyzer, I would go back right to the root of the trauma. A root that was suppressed for 30 years? For me, I used to lecture this 20 odd years ago, actually. The social contract was fundamentally compromised by Reagan and Thatcher because they destroyed a post-war consensus about what a state looked like. And here I ought to add, I'm working on a Hobbesian model because I always do for things like social contracts, unless I say otherwise. So this idea that the social contract is kind of nothing formal, nothing written, nothing kind of legalistic. Rather, it is a set of assumptions, deep-held truths about what the state will look like. Assumptions then that once we all share, we can kind of work out what is the role of government in such a state. What should it do? And natively agree. Guided as we are by our Hobbesian, our golden principle of doing to others what we would have done to ourselves. So what, of course, Thatcher and Reagan did was they questioned those assumptions about the role of the government in looking after the citizens. They fundamentally got rid of them. They replaced then a state who knew its job post-Second World War was to stop any such conflict ever happening again with a state where you could be a charlatan, an insider trader, a member of any ring you like, and succeed. But they wrapped it up in an awful lot of patriotism and an awful lot of this is the new social contract, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah-ism. And so it kind of was hidden. It was kind of hidden, I guess, until the 2010s revealed the failure of this system. It revealed it because after the banking collapse, there was no straightforward way of going back or even pretending to be part of that old model. Let me explain that more clearly. What do I mean by that is after the banking collapse, there was kind of a choice. Do you support the big banks or do you try to rework and go back to that old model where it was the role of the state to look after its people? And while not announcing anything, not saying we're going to not look after the people, we're only going to look after money, scoundrels like, of course, Cameron in Britain, but also, I'm afraid, Obama in America clearly put their priorities on the banks over the people. They plunged then their states into endless austerity that hugely in wealth a very small percent of the population. And at that point, the trauma started to bubble up and to surface. The fact that the social contract had been broken some time ago became palpable. And then there would be two moments, really, of utter breakage, I would have thought. The first is that issue, the one that consumes me, more than anything else, really, which is the failure, in spite of having all the circumstances and even a capitalism that left to itself probably would deliver relatively green energies, the failure of governments to want to do that. Therefore, the way that they have been brought up by big interests to not actually serve anything other than the big interests, and ironically not let capitalism do its job, destroy the oil industry and replace it with some sort of green technology. The willful failure then of governments to act in the face of a climate emergency, and their either inability or their active undermining, destroys any notion of the possibility that the government has our best interests at heart. And that basic social contract that has existed since the Second World War is clearly seen to be moribund. Secondly, of course, there is the right-wing reaction that began, well, in Britain, it began with Brexit. It really began with austerity, but austerity, in order to survive austerity, the right recodified how it understood the state so that it all became about flag waving and an assumption that actually below the flag waving, there was just a war of all against all. And the right really started to talk actively about the war of all against all, about the white nation, by which they mean Christendom, and the rest. And that is where, of course, we are. Effectively, you have then on one side a left that is endlessly grieving the inability of governments to save us from imminent annihilation in the next 50 years. I mean, not humans. Humans are like rats. They'll probably survive. But the kind of multi-textured societies in which we live, no, they won't. They're very vulnerable. And things like AI simply make them more vulnerable. On the one hand, and on the other, a belief amongst a certain bit of the right, the whipped up to wrap themselves in endless flags of the war of all against all, or at least their part of it. And so I said, what is very interesting about what survives in this world is that two great symbols of the old order have clearly survived, but now they are only understood through emotion and interlaced with a powerful set of emotions. So, on the one side, there is the right wrapping itself increasingly within the flag, understanding the world in terms of hate and love, because that is what's left. That is what's left of the order, of the symbols of the order. A violent hate or a violent love is what is holding the entire movement together. So it becomes unreachable by reason. It's not about reason. It doesn't matter that they are electing incompetent paedophiles or scammers who are prepared to skim the entire money off the system, roger their supporters. It doesn't matter. They don't expect anything more from their leaders anyway. The point about it is they wrap themselves in the flag and sing the right songs, that's all. Because in such an emotive world, that is all that matters. That's why someone like Farage is, of course, popular. He got the lesson of Thatcher. You just break the state, break it again, break it again, break it again. You create an awful lot of anger and poverty, and then you just cope with the anger. And that's what the flag is for. If you break the state and wrap it in patriotism, then nobody will notice it's you that's broken the state, or at least your supporters won't. And so one of the interesting things that have survived the end of the social order, which a muggins like me wouldn't necessarily have predicted, I really wouldn't, is the belief in the old state and a mythologization of a world that actually the very people they support helped to break. I mean the world of Britain in the 1950s, but now seen as some sort of mythological golden age, an age when politicians cared and looked after their people, but now dressed up in flag-waving hymns of hatred. It's a very strange, weird mythology if you think about it. They're mythologizing the very thing that their flag-waving leaders helped to break. And they're waving the flag, even as their leaders break the rest of their lives. Queer. And on the left, there is a mass emotion of wanting also for an old world order, or one that was always promised, that world order of the United Nations, of the rule of law, of taking people to Hague and trying them. A rule where genocide was really made illegal. Well, it kind of was after the Second World War, but that didn't stop anybody practicing it. Let's be honest about it. A world then of absolute law enforcement, where the standards of public life are sacrosanct, international, beautiful and eternal. Such an order then would immediately say the politics of surviving climate change and also the politics of post-colonialism are absolutely the same politics, because they're all caught up in the same weave of nations, the same weave of international law, the same emotive response to, we must try somebody, we must find out who's responsible and work out what we're going to do about it, but you've got to do it on the level of the nation-ism. You will have noticed I have a certain cynicism about that. For me, I could easily imagine a world where genocide carried on happily, but we still stopped eco-terrorism. It's just simple. It's not difficult to imagine. It's the politics that are difficult to imagine and impossible on the left, because our emotive response is now for a world order we always promised ourselves we would live in, or perhaps did. And what's fascinating then is that politicians who use the Starmer strategy just go nowhere. Now let me just tell you what the Starmer strategy is, because he never does. The Starmer strategy was to promise nothing. Okay? It was to promise nothing, but then just to do stuff, and to hope that people noticed that you did stuff. And if they noticed that actually you were running the state as it used to be run, actually a little bit for collective good, a little bit so that it was helping the poorest, that it was a little bit harking back to that 1950s image, and a little bit going towards the rule-based model, just a little bit, that doing it a little bit would be enough for people to say, oh, there's life in the old dog yet. The state might work. We might be able to get this thing going again. We might be able to do the politics of reasonableness in the middle somewhere or other. A politics of intellect that makes compromises, but might be okay. And our total inability to hear that is what he's doing is the bit I find fascinating. Genuinely fascinating. Because it tells you how far the system has collapsed. That a politician behaving according to the rules that worked probably in the 90s, worked for John Major. Well, it didn't really work for John Major, although he won an election on it. But a world of quiet efficiency, of just getting things done. That world is totally gone. Their world then of efficient and quiet technocrats who don't worry too much about the international order if they can't solve it. And certainly aren't so worried about patriotism if they can ignore it. It's over. And so with it, a certain way in which the state has been understood. Technocracy is now becoming the domain of the billionaire and their scams. It's shifting into something utterly, utterly malign, which is another interesting effect of this wide-scale collapse of that old social system where a technocracy was very linked to a rule-based system that was very linked to societies that cared. One by one, those old supports have gone. And what are we left with? Emotions of politicians of the greater moat, emoting for a lost world, or a world we always promised ourselves we would have, that naturally divides us up into parties. And between that, a veritable inferno. An inferno of asset-stripping millionaires, still using the fact that we can't renounce money because we're all caught up the system, still using the fact that none of us want to go to full civil war, although that is the logic of our positions, because for the obvious set of reasons. Using that then, using the last vestiges of the old system to make money, to become trillion, billion, quillion, whatever heirs, because it doesn't matter, it's all debt anyway. It's a very strange place to be. If you were busy writing a dystopia in the 1950s, you wouldn't have predicted particularly this one, I think. Because you wouldn't have predicted the wrapping yourself massively in the flag of the fealty to a system that never quite was, and all its emotions. And a state that is faced with the choice of the only way it can reinvent itself would be as some sort of malign technocracy in league with the billionaires, which is, of course, a choice it is being forced to make. So what are we going to do about it then?